The opinions expressed on this program are the views of the host and not necessarily the views of the University of Missouri St. Louis or this station.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of That Science and Nature Show. I'm your host, Jeremy Howard, and this week I am once again joined by Eunice Kahn.
Hello, everyone.
Sebastian Forward.
Hello there.
Becky Hansis O'Neill.
What's up?
And Andrea Trigueros.
Hi, everyone.
So, like last week, we're going to be covering some news articles and what's happened in the world of science and nature. In the back half, we'll be covering a topic of the show. So we'll be talking about green energy, moon farming, robots, and The Last of Us, to give you a little tease. So for our first article today, it's all about green energy, specifically green hydrogen. And that article is talking about, can green hydrogen help power Latin America? What this article is looking at is that they're trying to figure out, within South American countries, with the future energy demand being so high, what are possible alternative energy sources that we can use? And some scientists are looking at potentially using what's called green hydrogen as an energy source.
Hey, Jeremy, thank you for the intro. Just to give the audience a background, so we have like different types of hydrogen. Green hydrogen is one which is basically created from the use of renewable energy, like solar power or wind power. And in contrast, we can have like black hydrogen and gray hydrogen and even blue hydrogen. So the colors basically describe the energy that has been used, or the form of energy that has been used to generate the hydrogen. And I find this article really interesting because we as humans are in dire need of clean energy sources. And if we can switch to green hydrogen in the coming decades, that would be such a big breakthrough for us.
I'd like to throw in here just a little bit of history about the idea of hydrogen as a fuel source. It's been around for pretty much as long as all of the other renewable sources. And there was kind of a war between the hydrogen car faction and the electric car faction a couple days ago. And you'll notice that the electric car faction actually won that whole setup. And electric cars and just motor-powered vehicles are the ones that have pretty much taken over, and that's why, you know, all cars produced in the United States following I don't know, is a decade from now will be electric motor-driven cars. But there are a few areas where these electric cars aren't ideal, and one of those is really large vehicles like buses and public transit and things that have to move a lot of mass around. They also need a big battery. So one of the areas that the electric cars weren't really able to capture were these larger public transit options, and this is actually a little area that's still open to the hydrogen fuel market, and something that we're seeing people experiment with now, kind of still on a small scale, but we may see that expand in the future as renewably produced hydrogen becomes cheaper.
I have a question about hydrogen, because this was something I was just learning about today while I was reading. So what I remember of hydrogen water reactions is high school chemistry, where you get some isolated hydrogen gas, it gets exposed to the oxygen in the air, we have an initial burst of a nice thermal reaction, and then we get water. So I'm curious, just basics with hydrogen-powered cars, what do we do to make them safe so that those reactions don't get out of control, and what do you do with the excess water you generate? Does anybody know?
I will say I do. The cool thing about a hydrogen-powered car is it's basically just like an even simpler normal combustion engine. It uses the hydrogen as the fuel source and just air from outside the car to power it. It's pretty much a normal engine, and the water that it produces actually just goes out the back and is dropped out from the car, and the carbon dioxide, which is the other product of combustion, is released just like in any other car. But the good thing is, unlike normal gasoline, you can actually make the hydrogen fuel from a renewable source. So it is possible to have a green energy combustion car running off hydrogen as opposed to gasoline.
Right, so going back to those colors that Eunice was saying, the different types of hydrogen, so the color depends on the source that it's coming from, right?
Yeah.
So green would be from a renewable source, like solar energy, wind power, water dams, I think might also be included. And that is the case as they talk about in Costa Rica, right, where it's something crazy, like 99% of their power comes from renewable.
They have done an incredible job on setting up their renewable energy economy, which the same cannot be said for most other countries, and even in the United States we're only at a fraction of total grid electrification. But I think this hydrogen technology is really useful once you've completely electrified, because then you can start having excess energy that you can store as hydrogen. But I think this technology is gonna have to wait till we've found a use for all the energy we can make now, which that's not the case. We still need a lot more solar panels and a lot more wind farms before we reach that point.
So do you think we're close, 10 years off, 20 years off? Is this a realistic future we could see in our lifetimes?
I believe in our lifetimes, yes. It's not close. A lot of renewable energy technology kind of lives or dies on how quickly we can make it useful, and that's one of the big problems with nuclear and small nuclear, and also the fusion, totally. All of those are kind of useless if we can't make them before we build the entire grid around solar and wind, because once we do that, we won't need super expensive new technologies, because we'll have everything covered just in the far future, not yet.
That's true. And what I like is that most of the governments, especially the big powers, they're basically taking this issue very seriously. So the Chinese government, they plan to switch to electric vehicles. Like by 2025, they want to have 25% of all of their vehicles to be electric vehicles. And I think it's a big step, because there are more than 1 billion people, and imagine the number of cars and the carbon dioxide and other gases, their emission. So as Sebastian mentioned, we hope that within the next 10 years, we are going to be in a much better place than we are today.
Very cool. On to our next article. We are once again talking about the moon. We as scientists do love the moon. And this week, we're talking about an ingenious technique that could make moon farming possible. So some researchers are currently trying to see if using the soil in the moon, so the lunar soil, could grow plants like we do here on Earth. However, they seem to be running into two big problems. The first is that, unlike our Earth soil, the moon soil seems to have a lot less nitrogen in it, and nitrogen is a very key compound for your plants to grow. That's why we have it in a lot of our fertilizers that we throw in our lawns. And the other big problem that they're running into is that the soil, when it gets really wet, gets really, really dense, and doesn't allow for the roots to kind of spread down as they would in, again, our earthly soil. So I don't know what other science you can cover with that.
So the science for this is actually pretty cool, and I will say a lot of times there've been a few other articles recently about growing things on Martian soil or lunar soil, and I think it's very cool research, but the problem is that you don't need soil to grow plants, and you can do it much better without soil, in fact. And as a testament to that, a third of all of the tomatoes in the United States, and a third of all the tomatoes in the grocery store are actually grown hydroponically, and we on Earth have access to the best soil ever, at least in certain areas. So the process of hydroponics is basically just putting the plants in liquid fertilizer that allows them to get everything they need, but it basically completely eliminates the need for soil. And I really appreciate that they worked that into this model and figured out how you can make a hydroponic system with moon sand and with materials present on the moon.
I had no idea that we could grow plants with just water and without soil. I assumed, of course, we need soil because that's how nature works. So it's just like, paint a picture for me. It's just like a tomato growing in like a vat of water. Like, what is it?
Basically, a big old aquarium. You can float them in beads or something else to take up the space. Or if you have a fish tank, you simply can have a tomato plant growing in an aquarium so long as you provide the essential nitrogen and other little nutrients and minerals for it. Plants really don't care about the soil so long as they get the water they need and the nutrients they need, and they also need air in the roots, which might be a bit surprising, but they do intake oxygen through their roots, and so long as you give them all three of those things, they could not care less what they're growing in.
Okay, so farming on the moon. This is a topic that I'm very unfamiliar with, so I'm just going to ask maybe a very basic question. Okay, hydroponics, we need water. What about water on the moon?
That is a much harder thing to find, and there's been some recent discoveries in the past 10 years where we actually have found liquid water on the moon, given it's extremely full of dissolved salt. So it's basically like super concentrated seawater that people on the moon would have to boil off the water and recollect it. But we know there's water on the moon, and fortunately for the plants, we'll need to know where the water is when we go and try and hang out on the moon. So I figure the plant growing system, you basically just have to set aside a bunch of your water resources to run your plants. But that is where we could get the water. But yeah, I think that's how it would be done.
Yeah, and I think this experiment could work better on Mars as well, because we all know that Mars it has frozen water on its caps, on its polar caps. So we have the water, and I would assume that the soil will also have like these nutrients which are required, because the experiment works in a way that they pass the soil through a sorter, and then they basically process it and they extract the nutrients, and then they add those nutrients to the water, and then we have like the water which has all the nutrients, and then we can grow the plants on it. So I don't know if researchers have looked to it like in terms of Mars, but I feel like the water problem can be easy to navigate on Mars rather than on Moon. And given the fact that Mars is one of the planets that the humans have been eyeing to explore and maybe colonize as well in the next, say, a few decades.
I would like to point out that some of the most I guess inspirational discoveries have been lava tubes on Mars. They've found these areas that the temperature of Mars on the surface is terrible. It's either like way too hot or way too cold, and it takes a lot of insulation to keep us warm, like here in the middle of America. It takes a lot more insulation to stay warm when you're on Mars. But if you set up your little colony in a lava tube, I believe the average temperature of those tubes, because they're kind of underground, is about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So, just about as perfect a temperature as you could imagine for your little setup. So yeah, maybe someday we will have hydroponic farming in a lava tube on another celestial body out in space. So,
Sebastian, what is a lava tube?
A lava tube. A lava tube is formed basically when a bunch of really hot liquid rock is kind of pouring through an area. It will solidify around the edges, and this will kind of make a hole, and eventually the rest of the lava will kind of pass through it, so it will leave this space where the lava didn't cool in the middle, and these can be super giant tunnels, basically, under the surface, and we have them too here on Earth, out in Hawaii and pretty much anywhere with volcanic activity, you can find lava tubes and smaller ones too.
If you want to visit one on the mainland, Craters of the Moon National Monument in the middle of nowhere, Idaho, you can actually walk in them, and they are definitely big enough for a small moon base, in my opinion.
Nice, good to know.
All right. Well, for our last article, do you hate doing chores and housework? Me too. Well, I have great news for you. That according to BBC News, robots are expected to do 39% of domestic chores by 2033, so in the next decade, according to experts. So currently we have researchers from the United Kingdom and Japan that are looking at a lot of artificial intelligence and robots that can be programmed to do specific household chores. So think your laundry, your dishes, all that stuff that you hate doing, eventually be all automated. And they are trying to basically refine these so these robots can do multiple tasks, but it seems like the big problem they're running into is the robots have to be specifically designed to do a specific task rather than all of the tasks. So there's no android walking around your house doing all of your chores yet. But yeah, robots doing our chores. That is futuristic.
We do live in a world where Roombas already exist, and, you know, if you're willing to pay a little bit for it, they work quite well. So, you know, you can already eliminate, I know, growing up for a while, well, we didn't sweep our house. If you have a robot that can do it, that pretty much ends that task as a chore that you have to do forever.
Wait, you never had to sweep your house growing up?
Well, after we got a Roomba, we never did.
I have to say I was skeptical of the Roomba just because of how expensive it is. But, you know, struggling with like a vacuum with a cord, and just like the struggle of vacuuming. And, you know, the Roomba goes underneath the bed and things like that. So yeah, I would love to have a Roomba in the near future.
Yeah.
I think that would be helpful.
Getting a like sort of second-hand Roomba. That's how I acquired mine, and it's wonderful. Once again, I don't sweep my house. If I like knock over a houseplant, I can just do absolutely nothing about it, and then like tell the robot to clean it up. And given the robot doesn't respond when I do that, but if I go press the button, it does.
Plus, for us graduate students, that's extra time that we have not doing chores to work on our theses and dissertations.
Very true.
Right, because that's what I'm doing with that free time that I'm getting freed up for my chores.
Question. Roombas and dog hair. Do they survive dog hair?
Yes, but you have to clean them more often, I'm guessing, if you have significant dog situation going on.
Not sold.
Fair enough.
So one aspect of this study I find interesting is that the artificial intelligence experts think that only 28% of care work can be replaced by the robots in the upcoming 10 years. So care work means like looking after the elderly or looking after the kids. So what do you guys think, like in certain cases, if there are robots which can look after the kids or the elderly and do things like that, how it's going to impact our lives in good ways or in bad ways, or in both?
I think, you know, as with everything else, the tasks that are automated first will be the most simple ones, and that is how it's been for all of history, and that's how these things will slowly get taken off the board as far as jobs go. And I think the reason why like childcare, elder care, things like that, they're not going away anytime soon, because you have to be fairly qualified to do those jobs. You have to have licenses, you have to like be able to make ethical decisions, which is not something that robots can do. They may be able to sort your laundry, and they're probably really good at it, but as far as making moral choices, that is not their strong suit, and we will not be trying to get them to make ethical decisions anytime soon.
Totally agree on that. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned certifications and things like that. The article we're discussing mentions that just in the home, these tasks still won't necessarily be automated, like even without certifications and things. They also make the point that this is kind of a bummer because this is one of the few well, not few, but this is one of the areas where there's still a pretty significant like gender bias for who's doing the work, and that's changing.
That is true. It is one of their hopes. One of the things they talked about is potentially increasing gender equality by automating some of the tasks that are traditionally and currently like statistically more done by women, which could free them up to do other things and spend their time as they wish it, as opposed to doing like necessary household work. So that is one of their aspirations, and I think, that these things will slowly become automated, but I think, once again, starting at the simplest things first, and starting, unfortunately, as all technology, with the highest income bracket first.
Yeah, I agree. I think thinking about the cost of these products, right? Just going back to that Roomba and how expensive that is, and even dishwashers. When I came to the States, I'm from El Salvador, and back home, nobody has a dishwasher. And that is actually really helpful. It does cut off time from having to do all the dishes. And I think, where there is a huge gender inequity back in El Salvador, as in the article mentions in Japan, like compared to the UK, for example, they say UK roughly men and women do half and half, more or less equal of household chores, but in Japan, men only do like 1/5 of what women do, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like, I don't know the statistics for my home country, but it might be similar to that. So we're thinking about the affordability, right? And where these huge inequities exist and how that is still a long ways away. So yes, this technology is great and it's promising, and I think it will help to, kind of level the playing field, at least immediately. But, in terms of who can afford it, there's still a big divide there.
Although I never thought about a dishwasher and laundry machine being like household chore robots, which they're not very complicated robots, but I think they kind of are on second thought.
I definitely thought of them as robots when I came here. I was like, wow, this machine that does my dishes for me.
Hey, maybe 20 years from now, the Roomba will also be, and we will take our Roombas for granted at some point in the future.
There's a late scientist, what was his name? Hans Rosling, who looked at inequity and technology access, and he was old enough that he remembered when his mother got a washing machine. And instead of doing time-consuming laundry, she started reading him and his siblings' books when they were little. So where it is practical to do so, it seems to me like pushing to help make these things equitable is super important to helping upward mobility, especially if you're doing things like investing in education in your spare time and creating more equity. It seems good, though you gotta be practical, I think.
Yeah, one thing which I'm a bit skeptic about is like the privacy concerns, because we already read and hear in the news all the time that there have been instances where like someone's privacy has been compromised due to these different products and machines. So I don't know, like that part, I think that like the scientists, they need to work on more, because I think privacy is of utmost importance. And if there are privacy concerns, then people will simply not trust these robots, and they will, of course, obviously they will not use them. So again, even if the technology develops, people will be reluctant. So what do you guys think about this?
I think if you've already bought an Alexa or a similar product in your house, your Roomba's probably not the thing to worry about.
Graduations are under surveillance.
Yes. I agree with this point. My position in the whole technological privacy thing is that if you have a smartphone, like all of your personal and privacy data is already like on a server somewhere that, once again, they're under lock and key, but we're pretty much already living in a worst case scenario as far as like being surveilled. We are just fortunate to live in a place that doesn't care about our data enough to use it to threaten us for the most part. We do not live in a place whose government is currently using surveillance to hurt like the average person, which I think we're all very fortunate for, and I don't want to say that the privacy thing isn't an issue, but I don't think it's going to get that much worse, because we already carry around a, like, tracking device that records our, like, all of our actions and all of our sounds every day, and once again, not that many bad things are coming out of it for us, despite the fact that this is already going on, and we're kind of already aware of you know, privacy. Privacy isn't really a thing when you have a smartphone, in my opinion.
That is true. And we all know that when we think about something, we just start seeing ads on Facebook and Instagram all over there. So, yeah, that is correct. But I mean, still, this is something that needs to be, considered. Because if we as general public start to, take it for granted and say, hey, then people will be quick to start manipulating us. So,
That's true.
Yeah, that's my take on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think my issue with it might be hacking. There's been cases of, I think it's like home, like those cameras that you put for surveillance indoors and things being hacked. So whoever hacks it can like talk through the camera or, have access to what the camera is doing, things like that. And I think that might be a little scarier if you're talking about a robot that has movement, that can actually that is taking care of the elderly or a child or things like that. So I think that's where it comes in. Like, I don't see in the near future, maybe that's very like utopian or dystopian, of robots kind of taking care completely, but rather they're not going to like replace things like care workers, but rather kind of help out humans in these tasks.
Yeah, I think I'd have one concern onto that, which is less about privacy and more about hacking. So there's criticism that anything that's hooked up to the Internet of Things isn't very secure. So I would be concerned that if everything in my house was connected, let's say that gets hit with a ransomware attack, and suddenly I can't use any of my appliances until I pay someone money. So I also worry about things like that.
That is true.
Very true. I would be much more afraid of a, robot with arms coming after me than a Roomba.
One last thing I wanted to point out in the article, and Becky kind of touched on it a little bit, is that the access to technology obviously costs money, and there's, of course, the privacy concern as well, like Eunice brought up. But it kind of brings into a world of haves and have-nots. So the people that have the stuff to do the chores, to free up the time, and get more access to things, that the people who do not have that technology get less time to do those things and to have less access to opportunities like education or free time for stressing out or de-stressing out, all that stuff. So do we make anything of that? Or is it kind of like, that's the way the world works? Some people have money, some people don't.
I think that we're already living in that world. It's just that, the people with money can pay someone else to do the task as opposed to pay someone else to make something to do the task. So I feel like the dynamic wouldn't really change.
All right. Well, that's going to wrap up the news. So we will be right back with the topic of the show.
Music. Broadcasting from Millennium Student Center at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and online at umslradio.org. We are the voice of UMSL. We are UMSL Radio.
All right, we are back, and now it's time for topic of the show. So as I teased at the top, we're going to be talking about The Last of Us. So if you're unfamiliar, HBO currently has a show that's been airing since the beginning of the year called The Last of Us. It's based off this 2013 video game of the same name. And we're not going to spoil anything, no characters, arcs, or anything that happens to anybody. We're going to be, of course, as we're that science and nature show, talking about the science behind the show. So that The Last of Us is this current HBO hit, which basically follows this man and this girl who are traveling across post-apocalyptic America. And what has happened to America, basically, is that it has been ravaged by this cordyceps fungus, which has basically infected all of the inhabitants around the world, caused them to grow fungus all over them, and more or less transform into zombies, is the easiest way to describe it. The cordyceps fungus kind of, in the show, goes into somebody, it basically takes over their brain, starts to control their motor movement and all that, eventually grows all over the brain, and they become much more fungal looking with using sonar to move and interact with the world. Kind of like your typical zombie lore, the infected transmit their infection by biting other people, but they also have tendrils as well, part of the show's sort of lore. The way it basically starts, and this is very, very minor stuff that's discussed in the first 2 episodes, is basically the flower source gets infected by, or gets spores get into the flower source, and basically the flower source is a major distributor throughout the whole world. Everyone eats the flower products, and then everyone gets infected. So what we're going to be talking about today on that Science and Nature show is how much of this scenario could actually happen. Of course, we like to fantasize that these sort of doomsday scenarios are fun to watch on TV. We love our post-apocalyptic TV shows and serialized stuff like The Walking Dead and be like, man, it'd be so stressful living in this post-apocalyptic scenario. But we want to talk about the science. How much of this is fact? How much it's fiction? Could something like this happen? How much is sort of played up for the show, so on and so forth. So I'm going to break this down because I just threw a lot of information at you all into some smaller questions. So overall, the major biological agent in the show is fungus. It's based off the cordyceps fungus, which is actually a real fungus that can infect ants. But I guess I'll start with the panel. How likely do you think is it for a fungal infection of this caliber to happen, based on your own knowledge and what you've seen or read about the show?
Well, I'll start by saying that cordyceps fungi, they infect a variety of insects, so not just ants. And they're actually specialists, so meaning that they specialize on a specific species to infect. And the reason for that being, I guess, hijacking, that particular species requires specialization, right? And I think going from, there's several different species of cordyceps, going from this specialist, it's hard for them to even jump between species within like the same taxonomic group or like family. So making that leap from insects in cordyceps, right, from specialists in insects all the way to humans, I think it's a pretty big leap across the the tree of life.
I would like to rephrase your question as the likelihood of this happening in our world is very different from the likelihood of this versus any other zombie scenario, which I like to give them credit for like truly incorporating something scientific into their zombie lore, which it's one of the reasons why I've traditionally not liked zombie lore that much. Like I watched The Walking Dead, but they really don't try for the most part. The zombies are basically just magical. They don't follow any principles of like virology. Like I think all the characters are basically coated in zombie guts for like half of the show runtime, but they don't get the virus from just getting covered in it, which is kind of how these things generally work.
Can you explain the rules of virology? Because I don't know what those are.
That's fair. I was going to say a lot of zombie lore, I think, is from rabies, which is a virus. So sometimes the limb that's affected becomes paralyzed, and it's transmitted through saliva and brain matter only. So you could get covered in some guts with no problem. But this is kind of just a technicality of rabies.
I say my problem is that a lot of viruses they can only enter your body through like your eyes or your mouth or cuts, little nicks, scrapes, things like that. And the idea is that in a perfect world you might be able to get exposed to all this zombie gut stuff. But these people are running around in the wilderness. They're going to be covered in like cuts and scrapes, and like you can't shoot something or like hit a zombie with a sword at close range and not like splash zombie parts all over the place. And I really struggle with the fact that if the zombie bites you, you'll get the disease. but if like the zombie explodes in front of you, you won't get the disease, and that for me is a major plot point of all of the zombie materials to date, other than this particular show.
Yeah, speaking of plot points, I have two issues with The Last of Us Cordyceps pandemic. One being how the infection, how the fungi is transmitted. And so it's transmitted through the tendrils and through biting, right?
Yeah.
So this is different from how it happens in insects, right? So the cordyceps infects an individual, and then it manipulates the individual to go to a position where it will be best positioned to then grow the fruiting body of the fungus and then release its spores. So I think sometimes like you'll see the ants kind of go up a plant, their jaws will clasp onto a leaf, and from there they kind of go into this rigorous, like rigor mortis, I guess. I don't know. So they like latch onto the leaf, and from there the fruiting body grows out of the head, and it looks really gnarly.
So they do have the tendrils, right?
At least the brain control, the mind control thing is actually true. The fungi do like manipulate the behavior of the animals in order to spread their spores. And I think the spore part is it's mentioned in the other fungal zombie related genre, but it seems it's not really a big part of this. But I think the concept of spores are somewhat neglected here, because that's how fungi are normally transmitted. They have these tiny little like single celled bits that float around in the air, and when they land on something, they grow and they produce their little fungal tissues and then eat whatever they're in contact with. But that's
right. So with spores, you could potentially breathe in the spores, or like touch a surface that has spores and then touch, I don't know, a mucous membrane or something to get them into your body, right, and get infected. Mm-hmm. But that's not the case for this show.
So it's a big relief that the scenario that has been shown in the show will not likely happen to us, to human beings. But there are certain things that discussed in the show, they're kind of very accurate, like scientifically. For example, in the starting episode, they show two scientists from 1968, and they're talking about like something like this happening in the future. And one of them says that since there will be global warming and the temperatures will go up, so he kind of predicts this thing happening in the show. And in real life, there have been instances where these fungus things have happened like on different continents. And apparently there was no connection, no means of transportation between these three separate continents. And scientists think that maybe the higher temperature is the reason behind those things. So I like how certain parts of the show are very close to truth, and they are scientifically accurate. At least we can say like they're reasonable scientifically. So any other instance you can think of that you think the show has depicted like in a very good way, in a scientifically accurate way?
I'll say that, the concept of temperature and kind of the conditions outdoors absolutely do impact how diseases spread. And we know this because, flu season is in the winter, not in any particular reason because, flu only likes it cold. It's because people are indoors when it's in the winter, and when we're indoors, we share the same air, and it's easier for things to pass between people. And we know that however given that's just the case for flu, there are other diseases that people spread way more during summer, such as when people are out and going to events. We know that was a huge thing during the beginning of the pandemic, is everybody stayed away from each other and avoided big like outdoor venues, and a bunch of the other diseases that weren't COVID really didn't show up very much. We didn't have much of a flu season for a little while, and some of the other airborne diseases really dipped down during the early pandemic because people really do respond to weather and like climate variables, and that totally impacts how diseases spread.
Cool.
Yeah, I think this idea of it spreading from a central place was pretty interesting. If you think about especially how important fungus is in agriculture, where it's attacking plants that we've harvested, we're shipping grains, that kind of thing. And fungus is also much better at swapping genes than anything in the animal kingdom would be, especially if they're closely related. So I'm thinking of a study that we read in one of my classes last year where it was a single instance in Brazil where wheat from different countries all was sitting next to each other at a port, and we got closely related fungus, not quite, they weren't specialized, they had their own they were specialized, they had their own wheats that they could attack, and then they swapped some genes because they were all being stored together, and that expanded their ability to attack more grain stores in this particular case. So this idea in The Last of Us where you can get this fungus and something is very special about this fungus and it gets spread via commerce and just travel, and then here we go. So that sounded reasonable to me.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And actually, when we think about pandemics in general, right,
we just went through one of those, conveniently enough.
What is a pandemic? I haven't been through one. Like, all I read is in books and, from my grandparents and stuff.
The bubonic plague back in Europe back in the day.
So, anyways, Andrea.
No, so it's an interesting point that Becky brings up of this gene transfer, right? Because as we, continue to modify habitats, disrupt ecosystems, the likelihood of another pandemic just increases over time the more and more we destroy as climate change and continues to happen. And I think that might make for more possibilities of fungi, different species that may not normally interact, and that might be true for several other species. And that could be a dangerous combination for sure.
I think when you add in the concept of antibiotic resistance into this, and I know in the show they touch on it maybe a little bit too briefly about the fact that there isn't treatment for this disease, which is fairly important to the fact that it like destroys the world. The reason why we don't have many fungal diseases, and the same actually for bacteria too. There's compared to viruses, bacteria and fungi are much easier to treat. The Black Plague wiped out, tens of millions of people a couple hundred years ago, and currently, if you get the exact same bacterial disease, you can go to the doctor and get some antibiotics and be perfectly fine, like a couple weeks later. And the same goes for most of the fungal diseases, although fungi they're harder to treat because fungi are closer to animals like us than they are to bacteria, which means, any kind of medicine is basically just poison for something else that's living inside you. And when the other thing inside of you is closely related to you, that means that the stuff that's toxic to the fungi and the medicine for the fungi is also more dangerous for humans. So it's one of those issues that, the reason why we have so many more viruses is because we can't really treat them very well. We don't have good, each antiviral is kind of like a new specific thing, and that is an emerging field, whereas we're much better at treating the other types of diseases.
So in the show, like Eunice was mentioning in the first episode, when they jump back to the 1960s and basically are foreshadowing what's to come, they mentioned that funguses can't have. There's no such thing as a vaccine for a fungus. Does anyone know why that is, or why could we just have an antifungal spray? And then we're all done here.
I mean, for me, that was kind of one of the unrealistic parts of it too. Kind of the response of scientists to that. As Sebastian already mentioned, fungi are more closely related to humans, so it's more challenging to make medicine that is toxic to them, but doesn't harm us. So I think that's one of the major points. but there are antifungals. Like, it's not unheard of. And I think for a new species to outright say, you know, there's no cure is really unscientific. I think, I think, or maybe it was just kind of passed over fast to kind of move the narrative forward. But I do think scientists will try. You know, they'll put all their money, especially if it's going to happen at a global scale, right? A pandemic.
They will. So speaking of cures and vaccines, how do you think we can get ready for, like, I hope we don't have any pandemic soon, or we don't have it at all, but how do you think we can get ready for something like this or something similar to this? Because we don't even know the exact nature of the species that will be spreading the pandemic. So any measures that we can take, at least to be semi-ready or somewhat ready for things like this?
I think an emerging technology, and one of the true miracles of, like, the COVID-19 pandemic response has been the use of mRNA vaccines. And, you know, you've probably all heard the phrase mRNA vaccines. Those are, like, most of the big ones that have come out. It's basically just creating a little artificial snippet of the genetic code of the organism and kind of programming that in a way that you just kind of introduce it to a person, and it kind of automatically does this immune response and gives you the antibodies you need to protect it, as opposed to the old method, which is basically just giving someone a shredded up version of that actual virus, or, you know, that actual disease. This method, and I think the amazing part of it, is they were able to produce this vaccine within several days of getting the actual genetic sequence of this virus. They had this prototype vaccine almost instantly, and this is a process that could normally take years, and originally in the past, it would take years to produce a flu vaccine or, you know, any of the other things. But with this technology, we may be entering an era where if something like a new fungus popped up, you could sequence the genetic code, create your mRNA vaccine, and, you know, several days later start producing it. So I don't know that you could prepare for the specific organism, but we absolutely could, like, set up all of this infrastructure to be able to produce vaccines as soon as we detect an outbreak or something that could start another pandemic.
And I would hope, like, after the COVID-19, humans are relatively more ready for any pandemic. Again, we hope nothing happens because COVID-19 already messed up with our lives and everything so much. But still, I would say scientists and policymakers, governments, they should be more ready to tackle these challenges, right?
And we've proven the infrastructure for it, at least. You know, being able to produce, like, hundreds of millions of vaccines in a year or two is pretty amazing. You know, things didn't necessarily happen fast enough, and, you know, sometimes we were behind the ball, but for the most part, I think we have learned a lot from this that I am 100% sure we will be using this technology the next time a new virus shows up, or something that we don't already have vaccines for.
Okay, so as we wrap up our conversation, so one last thing I want to pose to the panel is just collectively, from what you've seen, read, watched with the Last of Us TV show, what are the major takeaways from someone who's not initiated with science? What's the good stuff they should get out of what they represent, and what's the bad stuff that's like, they tweak that, or they play this up a lot, or that's really fictional? What's fact versus fiction? What's the good stuff they can get out? What's the bad stuff that's kind of ill-informed about science, or about fungal infections and pandemics?
This idea that being in a more rural place where there's not lots of densely populated people would be safer with an infectious disease, like, we totally see that in The Last of Us. They get out to the middle of nowhere and they're like, we don't have to worry about the fungus, we just got to worry about people. So I'd say that is true.
I think one of the ideas that they pose is, I guess, for me, zombies are not dead people. They're like people with a disease. That's the thing I like, and that's the scientific aspect, is that you can work in, extreme behavioral changes and things like that into your concept of zombies, but you can't work in, bringing things back from the dead. That's just silly, but I give them props for making them scientific zombies, as I would say.
I'll just chime in. The one thing I really didn't like, I know Andrea, we talked to this weeks ago, is in the second episode when the mycologist goes to the lab. A mycologist is a fungal biologist, for those who don't know. They study mushrooms and spores and all that stuff. They go to the lab and they basically look at this cadaver and they're like, oh no, it's infected with this mushroom. And the woman just freaks out and goes back to the military and talks to them. And the military guy's like, what's the plan? And she's like, there is no plan. Bomb the city. Because he's like, there's no alleged cure for the fungus. A scientist would never just be like, we can't handle this. Just bomb everything.
Agreed. Also, she knows it was in the flour, so flour gets exported. So it's probably already left that city.
Yeah.
Right. I guess another one for me was how long the cordyceps infected, or the clickers as they call them, remain. Right. So the fungi controls the body. Yet you see like these bodies, kind of the zombies moving around, and it doesn't seem like they've really decayed much. So my thought is just how are the humans not decaying? What is the fungus doing to stop the process of decay?
Having to not starve to death is a problem. You would get very hungry as a fungus zombie not eating all the time, because we have to eat a lot to survive.
I'd also add, can a fungus or an infection suddenly give you another sense? No. It's not going to completely re-engineer your nervous system to be able to do that.
So if I eat mushrooms, Becky, I don't gain new abilities?
Echolocation ability?
Well, I was going to say, it depends on the mushroom.
Oh, I see.
Oh, one thing I did actually find accurate was the network, right? So fungi have this kind of a root network called hyphae. So this is how they can communicate, and they can communicate with plants and send these signals, right? And that's something that they include in the TV show The Last of Us, that if you might be pretty far away from an infected, but if you step on one of the hyphae, you send that signal all the way, and the infected knows that you're there. So it's this network that can work over long distances, communicate over long distances.
So I had a question about that, because I get the show in like snippets. So that works with plant and root and soil systems in the real world, but you don't really see that with things that move. So if the fungus is infecting people and they're moving around, how are they maintaining a connection to that network? So I was curious, like, what do you think? Do you think that could ever happen with a mobile organism?
That's a really good question. That sounds like a plot hole a little bit.
Maybe they have Bluetooth.
Maybe they just go back to the location they left, and then the fungi rapidly grow back into place and reconnect.
Ooh, I like that.
I will say that plenty of plants communicate with each other, even just through like scents and like chemicals that they release into the air, even if their roots aren't touching, or no part of the plant is actually connected. Plants do still interact with each other through the air, so you could mix in a little fungal pheromone communication mechanic
Volatile
in there.
compounds.
Yeah. So I haven't seen the show, but when Andrea talked about the the zombies having this network, reminded me of the show Stranger Things, in which like the Vecna also has similar network things. So I don't know if it is just something like the viewers like to watch, and it is something that is appealing to people. So of course, like, that was a popular show, still is a popular show. So I don't know if it is more of like to give this appeal to it, and how they communicate with each other. Just a guess, I mean.
It makes them scarier.
Absolutely. I will say I live very peacefully knowing that the massive underground connected network of like living organisms beneath my feet does not want to eat me. And I would be very scared if it did want to eat me. Which
that really adds to the tension in The Last of Us. So for all of you who haven't watched it, absolutely recommend it. The Last of Us is a great episode, is a great TV show.
Absolutely, Andrea. Last of Us is a fantastic TV show. Maybe not the most scientifically accurate, but great show, great characters, would highly recommend. That's going to conclude our show for this week. Thank you so much to Andrea and Becky and Sebastian and Eunice for joining me this week to talk all about The Last of Us. Next week, we'll be back with more Science and Nature show. But until then, my name is Jeremy Howard. You've been listening to That Science and Nature Show, and we're out.